your firmware is likely your next attack surface.
Hey, Mike, you have another interesting story about Microsoft reports about firmware-based attacks rather than software-based attacks. I know firmware is not a focus for most of the organizations, but still, it's very important part of cybersecurity posture. Would you like to elaborate more on this firmware-focused cyber attacks and what can be done?
Absolutely. Yeah, firmware is a very interesting kind of Achilles heel, right? It's kind of the lowest level you can get to, and as a result, it's not terribly transparent in a lot of cases. So it's interesting as that is sort of an emerging attack surface over the past few years to see some data points come out around that, which particularly drew me to this story. So Microsoft did a survey around what organizations in the enterprise space are doing around firmware security. And anytime that I look at these things, I always want to look at, sample size, where the survey was done, try to get an understanding of, how interesting the data points really are in the grand scheme of things. And this particular study looked at 1,000 different enterprise security decision makers and organizations across 5 countries: China, Germany, Japan, the UK, and the US. And I thought the inclusion of China was particularly interesting in that population there. And so, they asked a bunch of questions and they came back with some interesting data points, particularly that most security investments are going to things like security updates, vulnerability scanning, and various APT protection type solutions. Really not a surprise there. But, some of the data points that came out and some of the observations that were made were that firmware is coming in a very attractive target for cyber attackers. And they kind of did a riff on that, statement of there's 2 types of companies: those that have experienced a firmware attack and those who have experienced a firmware attack and just don't know it.
Yes.
And it's interesting because the first actual firmware malware in the wild was discovered back in 2018, which was a UEFI malware that was actually used to help find stolen laptops that was repurposed by some Russian threat actors. And this particular malware would survive OS reinstalls and complete system wipes. And the NIST NVD database has shown a 5-fold increase in firmware attacks since 2017, which certainly I'm sure was one of the impetuses for this study. But it was interesting that they found that 80% of the respondents, so 800 of these enterprise companies, had at least one firmware attack in the past 2 years. I thought that was a really interesting data point. And followed on the heels of that was that despite that firmware security was still last in line from a security protection investment perspective among that population. And this is driven by a couple of things. There's a lack of awareness, a lack of automation and visibility into the firmware, ability to quickly and efficiently deploy patches and upgrades. And there's a lot of risk there. You start tampering with firmware, you do run the risk of potentially bricking a device in some cases, right? So it becomes something where organizations are looking at, apparently very, very conservatively. And about 1/5 of the organizations, so about 21%, said that their firmware data at this point is completely unmonitored, not even being looked at. And of course, that's one of the things that the attackers are really counting on, because if they can get in and they can get into the organization and infect that firmware layer, it's not even being looked at. Their malware is going to load up in advance of kernel layer processes. It's going to load up in advance of any kind of security tools that you have there. And it's really going to give them the high ground, if you will, from that, kind of security vantage point perspective. And only about 1/3 of the businesses that they talked to had really made any kind of investment in hardware-based memory encryption or hardware-based kernel protections, which really are being considered a leading indicator of preparedness against these types of sophisticated kernel level attacks. So this is interesting in a lot of ways. There's some great data points that came out of the study overall. But one of the more interesting ones that I saw was that while today investment and visibility into this area really is lagging behind, that most organizations are looking at this as the next kind of focus area. And so like high 80, 90% ranges of these organizations were looking to make investments and, secure that particular attack surface going forward. And of those that were employing really these types of advanced types of protections, that about 2/3 of decision makers reported that, highly investing in security increased the efficiency and throughput of their organizations because it really freed up their security operations teams to get out of doing tactical patch deployment, repetitive, low value type of work, and really promoted them to do more business enabling things. It helped decrease downtime, making users more productive, and really helped drive the needle from a return on investment perspective inside the organization. And anytime you have a survey that points to really that business case justification and that return on investment argument for enhanced security spending and controls, I always think that that's a great story to tell, because it is something that oftentimes security is seen as a cost center. It's treated as a cost center, and unfortunately our adversaries, they're on the profit center side of that equation, and they treat malicious activity and the countering of those security countermeasures we put in place as a profit center, and treat it accordingly. So,
wow, that's a lot of information, Mike. I'll try to sum it up. Tell me whether I'm right or wrong in this scenario. Basically, even though firmware attacks are low at the time, but I think it's most important one in the sense, if some malicious code is residing in the kernel itself, it's really hard to detect unless you have really good mechanisms to identify it, right? In that scenario, you mentioned about kernel-based monitoring as well as hardware-based encryption. Those are some of the key elements that will be helpful to identify it. Is this a fair statement?
That's what the survey is reporting. Yeah.
Okay. And it's glad to see some big players are doing this study, and maybe hopefully we'll see some products or maybe tools to detect these in real time.